Say to my bride, let's go for a ride in my newfangled automobile. Just where we will go, nobody knows, but it's sure a great way to feel. Behind the wheel of the speed meter steel, it's my newfangled automobile.
Hello and welcome to Vintage Car History. I'm Wild Bill. There are many things in the U.S. that, whether they are actually from the country or not, are identified as being very American things. Certain foods, sports, and social norms make the USA a unique place to visit or live. And in the very early history of the car, there was one kind of car that, though made in other countries across the world in small numbers, really took off in the States to the point that many saw it as specifically American. So today, we'll take a look at the Highwheeler. A Highwheeler is not much more than a horse-drawn wagon or buggy with an engine of some kind bolted to it. Steam, gas, and electric power were all used on Highwheelers. Though the very European first cars, such as Ben's patent motor wagon, were technically Highwheelers, they quickly grew out of favor in Europe, and by the late 1890s, they were just about extinct on the continent. Not so across the pond. Unlike Europe of the time, the United States didn't have very many usable roads. For over a century in the U.S., if you went across the country in something other than a train, it was on foot, on horseback, or in a horse-drawn wagon or carriage of some kind. And since the roads were just about non-existent, very large wheels, some as big as 48 inches in diameter, were needed to have the ground clearance to be pulled across rough terrain. Frank and Freeland Duryea built the first production car in the USA in 1893, which was a Highwheeler. Like the first Daimler cars, it was a converted carriage using a single-cylinder 4-horsepower, 4-stroke engine, a friction plate clutch, and 2-speed transmission. It was quite crude mechanically, and from a distance didn't even look like a car. Its big wooden wheels with solid rubber tires were typical of any American carriage of the day. Other American automakers soon began to make these Highwheelers, and many began to refer to them as horseless carriages. Companies sprang up all over the country to make them: Baldwin, Winton, Autocar, St. Louis, and others. Highwheelers developed into two body types, carriage and wagon. The wagons were for more commercial use, moving small cargo loads, while the carriages were for personal transport. Most of these cars used the original suspension that came with the carriage or wagon, which in some cases made for a very bumpy ride. Since the USA at the turn of the 20th century was not nearly as densely populated as Europe was, garages were scarce, found only in the large cities. But local blacksmiths and carriage stables were common in small towns, and Highwheelers were therefore easier to maintain. Outside of the engine and transmission, anything else that might break or need attention could be handled by a local blacksmith or wheelwright, and lots of things would break. Even city traffic was difficult for the American Highwheeler. Wide sidewalks were the norm in America and were only for foot traffic. The streets were for horses, wagons, and eventually cars. Sidewalks were well maintained, often either paved or integrated into the front of a building with wood planks and a roof offering shelter for the pedestrians. The streets were not so cared for, and whether they were passable by horse, wagon, or car depended upon the weather. And where I live in Northeast Ohio, that gives about maybe 2 months within any given year where an unimproved, unpaved street is solid and safe enough to traverse. Out of the times, it's either thick mud or a frozen slick. Sometimes even a Highwheeler would need help just going down the street. Where the Highwheeler came into its own in the U.S. was on the East Coast and in the Midwest. Proper roads began to be built around 1900, at first primarily to connect major cities, but in the northern U.S., more smaller, privately built, though publicly used, roads were constructed. These roads were not of the best quality and not well maintained for the most part, but were drivable by a Highwheeler, and so they flourished. In the Midwest, the Highwheeler was well suited for use on the Great Plains. A farmer or rancher could use a Highwheeler much the same way as a modern farmer or rancher would use a four-wheel drive or ATV to get across acreage with no roads. By 1900, the Highwheeler design developed along with the technology and would lead to another American horseless carriage type, the runabout. Highwheelers would continue to be built in the U.S. until about 1915, when the road situation in the country was almost acceptable enough to no longer need them. Yes, if you look at a Highwheeler today, it's a primitive-looking thing. But 130 years ago, that was America! Thanks for watching Vintage Car History, and we'll see you next week. Peace.